is Joseph P. Farrell. Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell. It seems the start recording button doesn't start the audio and visual when it says it does, so I have to repeat myself. I'll get used to it, folks. But anyway, we're here with our 6th webinar on Islam. Let me go ahead and get the screen share started. Now, as you can tell, this is our moment where we are going to be talking about theological and philosophical critiques of Islam, namely its claim to be a kind of strict monotheism over against, of course, Christian Trinitarianism, and even to a certain degree, I might suggest, the tendencies of Jewish esotericism in the Kabbalistic tradition to a kind of multiplicity or internal distinction in the Godhead that you sometimes can associate with the Sephirot or the Tree of Life. But in any case, here in this webinar, we're concerned with a theological and philosophical critique of the idea that Islam has a strict monotheism because, as we're going to see, it has some very peculiar doctrines, one of them being that the Quran is eternal. So let's review here what we're going to be doing in this webinar. I'm going to be talking about 4 things. The first thing I want to talk about is simply kind of some miscellaneous doctrines associated with the emergence of Islam version 2.0, namely the idea of the nation of war, the poll tax or the jizya, the sharia, all of which are results, as I'm going to show you in this particular webinar, of what we've already referred to back in a previous webinar, in webinar number 2, called the theology of abrogation, which, if you'll recall, was that theology that abrogated the Meccan verses as being legally binding, and which elevated the Medinan verses of the Quran, which were the later verses which contained the so-called sword verses of the way Muslims are to interact with non-Muslims. Then in this webinar, I also want to talk about the Muslim doctrine, the Islamic 2.0 doctrine of dissimulation, or taqiyya or kitman. Then thirdly, which is the real thrust of this particular webinar, I want to talk briefly about the claim to strict monotheism in respect to its doctrine of the eternal Quran in the context of the Dome of the Rock inscriptions, which we reviewed in webinar 4, and then finally to kind of review the basic strategy that all of this adds up to in terms of a kind of historical critical appreciation or view of Islam 2.0. Now, in this webinar, we're going to be using principally 3 sources once again. The first 2 being, obviously, Did Muhammad Exist? Robert Spencer's excellent kind of 1-volume summary of the critical scholarship that's out there. Then again, we're going to be referring to Ibn Warraq in his collection of essays called Virgins, What Virgins? And then the third source that we're going to be referring to is Ibn Warraq's collection of scholarly articles beginning back in the 19th century and continuing on up into the 20th, called The Quest for the Historical Muhammad. Now, in referencing this work, we are going to be looking in particular at 2 essays, one by a contemporary Islamicist by the name of Arthur Jeffrey, and his essay called The Quest for the Historical Muhammad. And you find that in this volume from pages 339 to 357. And then we're going to be discussing the famous Jesuit Islamic scholar Henri Lamens and his essay, The Quran and Tradition, How the Life of Muhammad Was Composed, unquote. And you can find this in this volume from pages 169 to 187. And let's get started then with the first point of this webinar. Now, we've seen that the moral contradiction within Islam is based upon the assumptions of the standard narratives of Muhammad's life, that is to say, the Sirah, which again was first composed compiled by Ibn Ishaq, who died in the year 773. Now, you recall that Islam dates itself to Muhammad's alleged hijrah from Mecca to Medina, circa 620. Some scholars place that a little later, like around 622, but in that time frame. This alleged event forms the basis for the attempted resolution of the moral contradiction, as we've seen, by means of the theology of abrogation, which results in a regression, as we also saw, from the tolerant verses of Mecca to the intolerance of non-Muslims in the Medinan verses. Now, in terms of Islamic orthodoxy's own formulations, in other words, one cannot conclude that it is a religion of peace and tolerance. It's anything but. Because on the basis of the sword verses, idem est the Medinan verses of the Quran, one must conclude that the system itself, as distinguished, please notice, from all Muslims, is a religion or ideology of violence, genocide, and intolerance against non-Muslims. And it is in this respect that it is no less dangerous and world destabilizing an ideology than was Nazism or communism. Now, we're going to return to this point in the last webinar, but we raise it here again in order to draw attention to a few points. None of the legal traditions of contemporary Islam would be conceivable or possible without this unique feature of its standard narrative and the theology of abrogation within its orthodoxy, and the hadiths, which were compiled to ground the specific revelations of various portions of the Quran in the alleged events of the life of Muhammad. Effectively, this means that the hadith become as functionally important to Islam as the Quran itself, because without them, idem est, without the circumstances of Muhammad's life, the elaboration of the following things would have been impossible. The first thing that would have been impossible is the idea of the nation of Islam versus the nation of war, that is to say, the non-Muslim world, with which Islam must be in perpetual conflict until it is subdued. It should be until it is subdued. The second thing that's the problem, that is given birth, really, by this theology of abrogation and so on, is the whole idea of the jizya, or the poll tax, which emerges in a later period of the Mohammedan Muslim orthodoxy. Now, that's the poll tax that non-Muslims must pay in Islamic lands for the privilege of being left alone. Now, you'll notice that this is little more than a kind of divinely sanctioned mafia-like protection racket. The third point is that Sharia law itself, which is inclusive of the Muslim doctrines of halal, that is to say, their doctrines of ritual cleanliness of food and so on and so forth, attitudes towards women and so on, etc., are all themselves products of this theology of abrogation, the Medinan verses, the hadith, and so on. So in other words, all of this is Islam 2.0, and all of it depends on that life of Muhammad, his alleged deeds, and the circumstances surrounding the alleged revelation of certain verses of the Quran. So in other words, the theology is grounded in the alleged history. All this law, or Sharia, as Ibn Warraq notes, is, quote, based on four principles: the Quran, the Sunnah, or the deeds of the Prophet, which is incorporated in the recognized traditions, or hadith, the consensus, or ijma, of the scholars of the Orthodox community, and the method of reasoning by analogy, or qiyas, unquote. Now, you'll find that in Ibn Warraq again, Virgins, What Virgins, on page 257. Now, we're going to return to this point of consensus in a few moments. But presently, our focus must remain on Ibn Ishaq, the first biographer of Muhammad, and the implications of this first attempt to compile a workable biography to deal with this moral contradiction. Robert Spencer writes this. He says, quote, "The picture of Muhammad that emerges from Ibn Ishaq's biography is not what one might expect from the founder of one of the world's great religions. The Muhammad of Ibn Ishaq is not a peaceful teacher of the love of God and the brotherhood of man, but rather a warlord who fought numerous battles and ordered the assassination of his enemies. Quote, the character attributed to Muhammad in the biography of Ibn Ishaq, unquote, observed the 20th century historian David Margoulieth, quote, is exceedingly unfavorable. In order to gain his ends, he recoils from no expedient, and he approves of similar unscrupulousness on the part of his adherents when exercised in his interest, unquote. Now, continuing with Robert Spencer's quotation, it isn't so much Muhammad's wars that embarrass modern-day Muslims in the West. Those they can attribute to their prophet's particular time and place, glossing over his status as a good example, as for example in Quran Surah 33, verse 21, for Muslims in all times and places. Harder to explain away are the incidents such as the notorious Satanic Verses episode. Muhammad received a revelation naming 3 goddesses of the pagan Quraysh as daughters of Allah, worthy of veneration. And remember again, the Quraysh tribe was the tribe of Arabs that allegedly dwelt in and around Mecca. But when the Prophet of Islam realized that he had compromised his message of monotheism, he claimed that Satan had inspired those verses, and indeed that Satan interfered with the messages of all the prophets, and that you'll find in the 22nd surah at verse 52. Now, Muhammad quickly canceled the offending passages, but Ibn Ishaq tells the story of this incident, which most other early chroniclers of Muhammad's life omit from their accounts, unquote. And that's, again, from Robert Spencer's Did Muhammad Exist, pages 88 to 89. Now, the quotation of David Margoulieth, in which Spencer cites, is indeed much more sweeping, and in it Margoulieth makes a significant point both about Muhammad's first biographer and about the consistency of Islamic orthodoxy and its allegedly strict monotheism. Quote, the character attributed to Muhammad in the biography of Ibn Ishaq is exceedingly unfavorable. In order to gain his ends, he recoils from no expedient. He approves of similar unscrupulousness on the part of his adherents when exercised in his interest. He profits to the utmost from the chivalry of the Meccans, but rarely requites it with the like. He organizes assassinations and wholesale massacres. His career as a tyrant of Medina is that of a robber chief whose political economy consists in securing and dividing plunder, the distribution of the latter being at times carried out on principles which fail to satisfy his followers' ideas of justice. He is himself an unbridled libertine and encourages the same passion in his followers. For whatever he does, he is prepared to plead the express authorization of the deity. It is, however, impossible to find any doctrine which he is not prepared to abandon in order to secure a political end. At different points in his career, he abandons the unity of God and his claim to the title of the prophet. This is a disagreeable picture for the founder of a religion, and it cannot be pleaded that it is a picture drawn by an enemy. And though Ibn Ishaq's name was for some reason held in low esteem by the classical traditionists of the 3rd Islamic century, they make no attempt to discredit those portions of the biography which bear hardest on the character of their prophet, unquote. Now you'll find that quotation in Arthur Jeffries' The Quest of the Historical Muhammad, citing David Margoulieth from the Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, Volume 8, page 878, and you find all that in Ibn Warwick's collection of essays, The Quest for the Historical Muhammad, on pages 340 to 341. Now, this brings us back to the foundations of Islamic theology and the idea of an infallible consensus, and to a reason why, in spite of its golden age when Islamic civilization achieved a high degree of culture and science, it nonetheless quickly stagnated. And if you don't believe it did achieve a high degree of science and culture, remember that algebra is a crucial component in the history of science, without which all subsequent developments of higher mathematics would have been impossible, and that it is a Muslim invention of al-Jabr, whence we get the term algebra itself, and that we still use the efficient form of Arabic numerals in our everyday life. Nonetheless, the culture quickly stagnated. The question is, why? Now, many people suggest that it lies in the Muslim idea of consensus. Quote, many liberal Muslims, if that is not a contradiction in terms, get excited by ijma, sensing that somehow therein lies their only hope of modernizing Islam. However, historically, the notion of consensus has nothing democratic about it. The masses are expressly included. It is the consensus of suitably qualified and learned authorities. In other words, my friends, experts in the hadith. The doctrine of the infallibility of the consensus, far from allowing some liberty of reasoning as one might have expected, worked in favor of a progressive narrowing and hardening of doctrine, unquote. And you can find this in Ibn Waraq's essay, Islam, the Middle East, and Fascism. Incidentally, a fascinating essay in Virgins, What Virgins, on page 257. Now, what this means is if you can imagine trying to conduct scientific inquiry and innovation in the following atmosphere, then you have an understanding of why the culture stagnated. Quote, in Islam, the centrality of Muhammad knows no room whatsoever for innovation or bid'ah. What the Prophet approved is approved, and what he rejected is rejected for all time. Thus, the 15th century Islamic scholar Al-Kastalani rejected anything that is practiced without a relevant example from olden times, and, more especially in religion, anything that was not practiced in the time of the Prophet. The Prophet of Islam himself sums up these Islamic beliefs when he says in a hadith, verily, the most truthful communication is the book of Allah, in other words, the Quran. The best guidance is that of Muhammad, and the worst of all things is innovation. Every innovation is heresy, every heresy is error, and every error leads to hell. And this is citing An-Nasai at chapter 1, verse 143. It's quoted in Goldhitzer, Muslim Studies, pages 34 and 35. In another hadith, however, Muhammad seems to retreat from this hardline stance. He promises a reward, quote, to anyone who establishes in Islam a good sunnah, that is, an accepted practice, and warns against anyone who establishes in Islam an evil sunnah. And you'll find that in Spencer, Did Muhammad Exist, on pages 67 to 68. Now, in such a cultural context, doubt about any innovation is left in the hands, again, of the clerics, the experts of consensus, the guardians of consensus, and one will always therefore be under the potential threat of having innovated evilly and hence be subject to execution for heresy or apostasy. So in such a culture, ask yourself, would you be more inclined to publish a scientific treatise? Think of the case of Galileo writ large. If all this does not persuade that Islam is deeply a morally conflicted ideology, then one must take note also of the doctrine of taqiyya, or kitman, which is to say dissimulation, wherein one detects the implicit sense of privilege and double standard inculcated and sanctioned and practiced by adherents of its tenets. This, as Ibn Waraq notes, plays directly to the gullibility and sensibilities of Western culture and highlights the inherent dangers. For he notes the following incident, which I'm going to cite in full as an example. Quote, Western liberals, surprised and then alarmed at the presence of Islamic fundamentalists in their midst, turned in desperation in the 1990s to those Muslims whom they dubbed on flimsy evidence as Islamic reformers or modernizers, hoping the latter would have a moderating influence on the disaffected urban Muslim youth who refused to integrate into Western society. One such so-called reformer is Tariq Ramadan, the Swiss-born academic, grandson of Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and someone who has won the confidence of Western intellectuals, the liberal media, and even the British government, who asked him to serve on its task force on preventing Islamic extremism. But as Caroline Forrest has shown in a superbly documented book of analytical clarity and brilliance that first appeared in French in 2004 and is now translated, slightly abridged, into English, Ramadan is not to be trusted. He has managed to hoodwink the New York Times, Ian Baruma, Timothy Garton Oz, and other useful idiots, but again, it is not very difficult to fool the latter who do not know their madrasas from their alts. Forrest displays before us Ramadan's art of duplicity and dissects with precision the anatomy of his Islamic subterfuges: equivocation, evasiveness, ambiguity, euphemism, the rhetorical device of redefinition of words, sins of omission, and brazen lies, unquote. And this is from his essay, Brother Tariq and the Muslim Hoods, in Virgins What Versions, page 414. Now, this is the doctrine of dissimulation, or taqiyya or kitman, a, quote, doctrine of pious fraud or religious dissimulation derived from surahs such as number 3, verse 28, whereby Muslims may, under certain circumstances, openly deceive infidels by feigning friendship or goodwill, provided their heart remains true to Islam. Historian al-Tabari, who died in 923, wrote on Surah 16:108, if anyone is compelled and professes unbelief with his tongue, while his heart contradicts him, in order to escape his enemies, no blame falls on him, because God takes his servants as their hearts believe, unquote. And you'll find this again in Ibn Warraq on page 413 to 414, citing the Encyclopedia of Islam, 2nd edition, and Rabin Ibrahim, the editor of the Al-Qaeda Reader, in 2007. I've added the emphasis here. Now, note the implication here, because it means that in any situation or context that the individual Muslim deems hostile, for example, in the context of a non-Islamic culture, it is permissible to dissimulate or lie about one's opinions or beliefs if one's heart, quote unquote, remains in Islam, idem est, remains in submission. The bottom line is that the ideology of Islamic orthodoxy, in essence, is saying that no other culture can ever really trust it, even when it seems to be docile or assimilating, introducing yet another moral and ethical difficulty into the system. So now, with this in mind, let's turn to the claim of strict monotheism, to the idea of the eternal Quran, and to the Dome of the Rock inscriptions, and to the pre-existent Muhammad. We're going to look closely here at some internal systemic contradictions to Islamic claims to strict monotheism by looking back at the inscriptions of the Dome of the Rock, that should be Dome, not Rome, and understanding them or interpreting them in the way that Islamic Mohammedan orthodoxy understands them. Over and over, you'll recall those inscriptions repeat the statement, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, there is no God but God, he is one, he has no associate. Or, far be it removed from his transcendent majesty that he should have a son. Or, say not three, cease, it is better for you. Or, praise be to God, who hath no partner in the sovereignty, unquote. Now again, you'll find those passages if you look back at Spencer's collection of the Dome of the Rock inscriptions on pages 50 to 52. But note, however, this is quickly contradicted by what the Quran says about itself. Quote, for Muslims, the Quran is a perfect copy of the perfect eternal book, the mother of the book, the al-Kitab, that has existed forever with Allah in paradise. The Quran testifies this of itself, quote, by the clear book, behold, we have made it an Arabic Quran. Haply you will understand, and behold, it is in the essence of the book, al-Kitab, with us, sublime indeed, wise, unquote. And you'll find that at Surah 43, verses 2 to 4, citing Spencer there in his book on page 126, and I've added the emphasis. Now, Ibn Warraq notes the same point, citing different surahs and verses, quote, the Quran is a faithful and unalterable reproduction of the original scriptures which are preserved in heaven, unquote. And he's citing Surah 56, verses 77 to 80, and then Surah 43, verse 4. That's in Virgins What Virgins on page 256. In other words, The earthly Quran is a copy or reflection, as it were, of the mother of the book, the eternal Quran, which coexists, therefore, and is co-eternal, therefore, with Allah in heaven. In effect, if one wishes to view this in quasi-Trinitarian terms borrowed from Christianity, the Quran, the book, replaces Christ, the co-eternal person or logos of God. In effect, one has depersonalized that doctrine and replaced it with something cold and unalterable rule book in which, in effect, shares the sovereignty of Allah. But if that's so, where's the Islamic equivalent of the Holy Spirit? In this respect, it's worth noting something that was mentioned by the great Jesuit Islamic scholar Henri Lamens. He says, quote, "The pre-existence of the soul of Muhammad is a favorite dogma of the tradition, accepted as a belief by the Sirah, but of Platonic and Gnostic origin. Both have taken the idea and read it into certain texts, which they have badly understood, where Allah says to the faithful, 'We have sent you a light,' unquote. This term was taken up later and applied to the living person of the prophet," unquote. And we're citing Henri Lamens, the famous Jesuit Islamicist, in his essay, The Quran in Tradition, which you'll find in Ibn Warraq, The Quest for the Historical Muhammad, on page 171. So in other words, Muhammad, in his own pre-existence, would thus be coexistent with Allah and with the co-eternal Quran, and thus functions as kind of the interpreter of the book by his life and practice establishing, or sunnah, deeds, performing a similar role in Islamic orthodoxy to the Holy Spirit in Christian Trinitarian tradition. But in any case, the co-eternal book itself would seem to raise difficulties with the claim to a strict monotheism. Now, let's look finally at our fourth point here, because when you take all that we've said in these previous webinars about the history and the historical narrative of Islam versus the critical historical scholarship, when you look at the coins, when you look at Dr. Patricia Crone, when you look even at some of these theological points that we've just discussed in this particular webinar, we see an intriguing strategy emerging in this critical scholarly literature. First of all, we've established that there's a moral contradiction. We have the Meccan and Medinan verses, which arises from the theology of abrogation, which established the Medinan verses, the verses with the sword verses, as the basis for Islamic law. And this, in turn, is dependent on the standard or orthodox Muslim narrative of its origins in the life of Muhammad. But that history itself, in turn, is problematical in the extreme, as we've seen. So by knocking, fourthly, the pillars of history out from underneath the religion, the foundations of the entire dogmatic structure of Mohammedan Islamic orthodoxy, or Islam too, as Volker Popp and Luxemburg have called it, is completely undercut. And with it, the entire edifice of jihad Sharia consensus has also been undercut. And then fifthly and finally, even though this strategy has not included a direct polemic against Islamic monotheism, what we've suggested here in this short little webinar is that this too appears to be a kind of disguised Trinitarianism, badly mangled, obviously, which would corroborate in another way the scholarly consensus that early Islam seemed to have merged from some sort of Christian and Nestorian roots. So with that, my friends, we're at the end of the 6th webinar, and I'll see you in the flip side for the final and 7th webinar and some concluding personal remarks.